All right, thank you very much for that intro. We'll let people come in and take seats, and if you got your coffee or whatever else to get charged up for this infrastructure discussion, please do come in and join us, and we'll get started in a moment. We've got a great panel to talk about financing the future of infrastructure. We're going to talk about public-private partnerships and whether they work, how they work, what the problems with them may be. I'll talk about the administration's approach to this a little bit. We've got a great panel to discuss it. Margaret Anadu is Managing Director of the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs. Tom Wright is the President of the Regional Plan Association. Lise Kingo is the CEO and Executive Director at the UN Global Compact. And Amy Lloyd is Director at Citigroup, Inc. So a great group of panelists to discuss this important and complicated topic, and I'm going to talk to them a little bit about how hard it was for me to get here this morning and how that shows where our infrastructure is right now, coming from Jersey to Manhattan. So I've got a little personal stake in this to start with. Welcome our panelists. All right, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Thanks for being here on a beautiful day in Manhattan to talk about infrastructure and public-private partnerships. And I thought, Margaret, we'd start with you. You're down on that end, but first in our hearts. And to talk a little bit about, first of all, my own personal narrative of infrastructure this morning. I live in Englewood, New Jersey, which does not have great access to the city. You can get on a gypsy bus to get across the George Washington Bridge and then take the A train down, or you can do what I did, which was get in an Uber that tells you that you're going to get from your house at 8:20 a.m. here by 9:25 a.m. with plenty of time to have a coffee and relax and get ready for a panel, or it can take you almost an hour and a half and be stressed out in the back of the cab looking at the Uber tick away to being late for your panel. So my personal story is the infrastructure of transportation from where I live in New Jersey to New York is bad, and the roads are bad, and the tunnel is bad, and we need another tunnel, another access point from Jersey to New York. So anyway, my personal story. But Margaret, let's talk about, you can talk about that if you want, why it's so much of a pain in the butt to get from Jersey to Manhattan from that area. But I wanted to talk more broadly about your experience leveraging public money and private partnerships on infrastructure projects. It's a hot topic. It's the centerpiece of the administration's proposal, which I'm not sure is really going anywhere. But tell us what's good about it, what's bad about it.
Sure. So I run the Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group, and we invest about $1 billion annually in all sorts of project finance in underserved communities. So that's everything from housing, schools, grocery stores, the pieces that are a part of our life every day, and the infrastructure that unfortunately I think is actually getting a little bit left out of the conversation. So I think when a lot of people talk about infrastructure, and certainly what people think of in the bill and conversations today, we think about airports, roads, bridges, et cetera, as opposed to thinking about, where are those roads and bridges taking us? So where do you live? Where do you work? Where are you going for your healthcare needs? What schools do you go to? And so our focus is thinking about the types of infrastructure that we can finance that actually create opportunity for people and are part of our everyday lives. So we've worked with local city governments, state, and even at the federal level to think about comprehensive economic development in communities, affordable housing, grocery stores, schools, industrial facilities. And we found that it really works best when there is some plan in mind, that it's not just about, financing the next great toll road, but what are the things around that development? What is the housing plan around that? When we think about additional rail stops, where are we trying to get people? Where are people moving? How are we developing assets that are actually going to be productive in people's lives? And so that's what we're working on. It's difficult work, and excited to talk more about it.
Okay, Tom, let's jump over to you. And you, I think, recently put out a paper with kind of infrastructure goals, like moonshot ideas for how we can improve infrastructure around the country and in this area in particular. But I want to get just to the idea that it's a good idea to do public-private partnerships, that this can work and does work. Does it?
Yes. And actually, there are public-private partnerships moving forward in the region right now. LaGuardia Airport, the Goethals Bridge, And so we've started to see those things going forward. I'll take a step back, and for the record, I didn't ask him to open with a complaint about his commute, but that is kind of what we're living with in the metropolitan region, just to kind of give a sense of the large trends and what's happening. Like when I was a kid growing up on the Upper West Side and out in New Jersey, the 31 county area that RPA looks at, kind of Trenton to New Haven, Lower Hudson Valley, Long Island, it was a suburbanizing economy. During that generation, for every 10 jobs that we created in the 31 county, 782 city region that we think about at RPA, 9 of those jobs were outside New York City. 1 of them was in New York City. It was the Wealth Belt of New Jersey. It was Fairfield County, Westchester, Nassau County. And so we saw at the end of the 20th century kind of job growth going out there. What's happened in the last 10, 15 years is not just that New York is kind of caught up with the rest of the region, but today, New York City accounts for almost 90% of the job growth of the entire region. New York City has added some 600,000 jobs in just the last 5 or 6 years, and New Jersey's just barely gotten back to where it was in 2008. So we're seeing now, and of course we're seeing with millennials and others also wanting to live closer into cities. It used to be essentially that the further out you were on the edges of the region, the faster economic growth, population growth you saw, and now all that's been turned on its head. The problem is we don't have the infrastructure system in place to accommodate that kind of growth. Thank God we have things like the Hudson Yards and the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan coming online with new commercial office space, and we're seeing older space be redeveloped. And of course, the fastest growing parts of the city are actually Brooklyn and Queens. But it doesn't work unless you can get around. And just to give kind of a sense of what's been happening lately, in the last 6 years, the number of people flying in and out of our airports, Newark, Kennedy, and LaGuardia, has gone up by about 25% in 6 years. We've gone from a little over 100 million to about 130 million annual passengers flying through those 3 airports. That's adding another LaGuardia to the system. Now, we did it by, squeezing into seats and bigger planes, but eventually we're going to need new runways, and it's going to require new financing to do that. You look at the Hudson River, everything, also almost 90% of new commuters coming into New York over the last generation have come from west of the Hudson River. Long Island today sends the same number of people this morning to jobs in New York City that it did 30 years ago. Zero growth over an entire generation. Why? Because they had no capacity in the Long Island Railroad, and because they have very poor land use planning. They don't do the kind of work that Margaret's team does to provide multifamily and affordable and rental housing. And so you've seen these enormous disconnects, enormous growth and pressure and demand in parts of the system, and no response to it. And so public-private partnerships are going to be, I think, the only kind of way that we were able to get these projects and do the kinds of investments that we need to keep growing the prosperity in the metropolitan economy.
Okay, Lise, let's talk a little bit about the international perspective on this and your experience in various countries. You bring a little bit of a different skill set and issue set to this discussion, but in your experience, how does the private sector and the public sector work together on these issues of sustainable development and infrastructure and transportation? Give us more of a global view.
Thank you, Ben. Well, I'm happy this morning to represent a global perspective on the whole infrastructure and cities issue. And at the UN Global Compact, we are very busy these days translating and promoting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to the business community across the world. And I really want this morning to congratulate the New York Mayor, Mr. de Blasio, for committing to reporting on how New York as a city is progressing on each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as of now, which I think is an excellent symbolic act to show that these 17 goals are really crucial for mayors and for city development as well. For those of you that might not be able to wake up in the middle of the night and recall all the 17 goals from the UN, I'd just like to remind you that
That's what I do every night. I don't know.
You could do that, Ben.
Yeah.
That goal number 11 is actually relating to cities and how to create sustainable cities across the world. And at the high-level political forum at the UN in July, we will actually dedicate significant time to discuss the cities issue. So why is it relevant for the UN to focus on cities as part of these goals? I think it's very clear that around 2050, the estimate is that 70% of the planet's population will live in mega cities. Mm-hmm. So it will mean a lot how these cities are constructed, if they are constructed in a sustainable way that caters for healthy living, that caters for good human rights, that caters for anti-corruption. So we are very keen on helping to put a focus on how cities are developed in the future and what is the agenda for development of cities. Many of these cities are still not built. They are under construction. Mm-hmm. And if we could decide or agree on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and UN principles as the common denominator for how we develop these cities going forward, we think that might be an amazing agenda. And of course, as we already heard several examples on, it has to be done in partnership between the public and the private sector, but still we need a common agenda. And let me just give you one very concrete example. I think we all know that the major urbanization is going to happen in the African continent and across Asia. We also know that in that particular part of the world, when people move from a rural area to an urban area, the health risk of developing chronic diseases like diabetes, for example, goes up 5 times. It's a disease that by and by makes it very difficult for people to sustain their own families, sustain their own lives. It decreases the life quality of people, and it becomes very expensive for society to support these people when they get ill. So one of the focus areas for creating new cities is to think about health, healthy lifestyle, possibilities for creating the cities not for cars, but for people, and catering for a healthy lifestyle in that process. Yeah. So there are lots of important agendas to think about in the way we optimize infrastructure, we optimize the way we create the cities. And I hope that I'm not sure how much the Sustainable Development Goals have been addressed in a cities event like this. But again, back to New York as a great example of really picking up this agenda. And as we all know, when you start to measure, it's always easier to manage. So living in this city, I look forward to seeing the progress of how to creating a more healthy and a more sustainable city in New York.
It's not a healthy lifestyle to stress out in the back of an Uber. Let's just put it that way. So Amy, talk to me from the Citigroup perspective on the private sector, and like, is this an area where the private sector can really make a bunch of dough in public-private partnerships? Like, what is the business case for doing these things? Like, you're not in this for philanthropy, you're not in it for, obviously we all share these goals, we want livable cities, we want better infrastructure, transportation, but when you talk about Goldman, when you talk about Citi, these are money-making operations.
They are, but I'll address, and I can't answer your Uber problem from this morning, unfortunately.
Somebody's going to answer it for me.
That's right.
Congestion pricing.
But you've actually touched on what I think is one of the biggest issues of public perception of P3s or PPPs, which is that they're more expensive, or that these are profit entities who are trying to make money off public facilities, essentially. And I want to address some of that, but before I do, I often get asked, I'm very excited to speak at panels like this, because I think what our industry needs the most is thought leadership. Because I think people often ask me why the US PPP or P3 market is falling behind other jurisdictions. So successful markets like Canada, Australia, Europe, the UK. When you think about the funding need, so we talk about potholes, or we talk about delays in traveling to destinations, or crumbling infrastructure. And just to put a number around that, it's estimated that the funding need for infrastructure in the US alone out to 2025, so the next 7 years, is over $3 trillion. And then that grows actually to go over $10 trillion by 2040. So that's an enormous amount of money that needs to go into infrastructure in the US, only half of which is estimated to be funded. So there's an enormous funding gap. And the question really is, how do we solve that? And most of us in the industry think that PPPs are the answer to that. And I'll tell you why. But before I do, one of the features of the US market that people perhaps don't appreciate, and certainly from a Citi Goldman perspective, is very obvious, is that governments in the US who are responsible for funding their infrastructure and developing their infrastructure have unique access to the tax-exempt financing market, which doesn't exist in any other jurisdiction around the world. So that's been very good in historical terms, because that's allowed governments to source very efficient funding, and they secure that funding by raising taxes, gas taxes, other special taxes, user fees, so tolls on roads where that's appropriate. But there's a limit to that funding capacity. And the problem with that market, different to the rest of the world, is that it's given the public and governments a perception that P3s are expensive, because P3s are delivered by profit entities. So back to the question, they're for-profit entities, and they are equity developers who are going to need to make a return on their investment for the risk that they're taking. They're construction companies and operators who are for-profit entities, so they're looking to make a profit margin on the services that they're providing. So these entities are looking to make money on their businesses. They are not-for-profit entities. But at the same time, the value creation of a PPP is the transfer of risk. So what a PPP can bring is the delivery of, and right. Tom touched on this, LaGuardia. It's the delivery of a project earlier than the government could afford to do it. So LaGuardia for me is the perfect local example of a PPP. Some of you may have passed through LaGuardia. In fact, 30 million passengers passed through that airport last year alone. So some might be surprised to hear that, because it actually surpasses Newark and New York and JFK, in passenger numbers. And if you went through it, I don't know if Ben's gone through it recently, but there's a lot of construction and a lot of delays.
Ben has been through it recently, and he has feelings about that as well.
Right. And that's a very current frustration, and it's short-lived. The construction will only last for 5 or 6 years. But that's the perfect example of a mega complex construction project that was the perfect fit for a PPP. Yeah. The Port Authority actually went to a private sector and under 36 and some change lease, so a long-term concession. The private consortium is responsible for constructing the project, operating and maintaining it over 30 years, and to performance standards. So that's a really important feature of the PPP. They will have to, and in fact on that project, very complicated, they have to operate and maintain the existing terminal, Terminal B, while they're constructing the new terminal and building a head house. So the new, some of you may have seen they've relocated the car park, and they're building a brand new entry that will serve for the entire airport. It's the largest US P3 project completed to date. I can proudly say Citi was the manager of the tax-exempt financing, so we were part of the profit entity that worked on the project. But the Port Authority and New York, quite frankly, could not have delivered that project as early as they're doing that if they relied on their source of funds themselves.
Yeah, Margaret, I'm going to give you a chance to say all the great things that Goldman has done and be involved with, not just going to be touting Citigroup here. I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I wonder if, Tom, you could walk us through very quickly the structure of that LaGuardia agreement, because I knew it was a public-private partnership, and you see the signs, and we've all, been through the gauntlet of traffic at LaGuardia. But quickly tell us how that came together, and is that a good example?
Well, or on specific dollars, maybe Amy should do more. But I think, let me compare and contrast that for a moment. And the Port Authority has been really the agency in the region that's been starting to successfully do these public-private partnerships. And what we need to do is see it expand. In some ways, I've heard people say that maybe historically what happened in the United States was we got so good at municipal finance that we didn't have to find some other mechanisms, and we stayed with it for so long. But again, the problem becomes that there isn't the kind of incentive mechanism to make sure that the project stays on time and budget. And time becomes the critical factor on these things. To compare, say, LaGuardia to East Side Access, which is the largest infrastructure project in the region and I think the nation right now until we build the new tunnel under the Hudson River. That is, the next time any of you are at Grand Central in the beautiful station looking at the clock and everything, you should look down at your feet and realize that about 100 feet below you, an enormous 2-level station has been hewn out of the rock. And in about 4.5 years, it's going to open up, and over 60,000 Long Island Railroad passengers are going to have a 1-seat ride to the east side instead of having to go to Penn Station and then backtrack on crowded subways. It's a very valuable project. It's going to change the economic geography of Long Island. It's going to add more capacity and redundancy and resiliency to the entire commuter railroad system. It opens up space at Penn Station for Metro North and New Haven riders to come down. So it has enormous benefits. But it's way over budget and way behind schedule. It's I think around right now about 3 times what it was originally budgeted for. Part of the problem with that project as it started out was they didn't have the funding in one capital plan to pay for it. And so the MTA intentionally spread it out over multiple capital plans and kind of said, let's not do it in 5 years or the fastest we can. Let's try and make it 7, 8, 9 so that we can grab more pots of money. LaGuardia would never be done that way. The venture, the group building LaGuardia starts to make money the day it opens. So they want to open it as soon as they can. And it's the time that adds to the expenses of these projects enormously. And so moving, I agree with the other panelists. I think that moving to the public-private partnerships so that there's an incentive mechanism to do the projects as quickly and efficiently and affordably as possible far outweighs any kind of profit incentive that we see by doing that by these mechanisms.
Yeah, I should say this big cavernous new set of tunnels under Grand Central is also going to be the set of the next Die Hard movie, so get ready for that one. So Margaret, talk to us about your experience at Goldman with these public-private partnerships. I know you've done work in Detroit, you've done work in Newark, you've done work in cities around the country that are struggling urban cores that are trying to revitalize themselves, improve themselves, and use these public-private partnerships in doing that. Where have you seen the biggest successes?
Yeah, maybe even to start with New York and keeping it local. And one of the things that sort of some of my other panelists made me think about, I think people get nervous about public-private partnerships because I think it conjures up images of privatization and that profit motives can be negative and the public sector can lose control. And so just thinking about an example here in New York that we've been really excited to be a part of. So our firm has committed about $500 million to a project right in the heart of the Lower East Side, at the heart of the Williamsburg Bridge, and really taking advantage of some of New York City's great infrastructure. So it sits right at the foot of the Williamsburg Bridge. It's served by a couple different subway stops, and was the largest undeveloped plot of land in Manhattan below 96th Street. And if you can believe this, which it feels unbelievable in hindsight, this land sat vacant for 50 years. So it was an old urban renewal plan gone wrong. It initially housed about 2,000 or so low-income tenants, and the city raised those projects basically with a promise to build those units back. And squabbling different administrations couldn't really get it together. And so the public-private partnership that really kind of got this development back on its feet was during the Bloomberg administration, really bringing all the stakeholders to the table. So the local community boards, a lot of local not-for-profits to decide, what are we going to do with all this land? And so the grand compromise, if you will, was thousands of units of housing, half of it affordable, commercial, retail, healthcare space, really all of the uses that we think about in really bringing a community true opportunity. And what the city did, which is incredibly smart, is a lot of that land is on 99-year ground leases. So they still have a stake in it. There's private ownership, which we're a part of. We provided private equity and then some sources of debt. But if the construction isn't done on time, if the uses that were promised, so the affordable housing, the schools, et cetera, aren't delivered on the time schedule that was originally agreed to, the city of New York has the right to simply take the land back. And so a lot of that complexity and real issues of trust that you see in a lot of these partnerships were really hammered out in very strong legal agreements. And so not only is the for-profit venture, which we're a part of, incentivized to deliver those goods because, we're going to start to make money when cash flow is there and the units are rented and all the tenants are in. But also there's that, hammer sitting there that if those things aren't delivered and if the small business space isn't delivered and if the, it got very specific. For example, the community wanted a movie theater, a grocery store. If those things aren't delivered, the city of New York says, okay, time's up. We're going to take this land back and we're going to find someone else to do this. So I think that's an example that's great because it's a large project, but it's almost the smaller infrastructure, the housing units, the schools, et cetera, that really take advantage of some of the strong infrastructure that the city already has and does it in a partnership with not just the public sector, but that local community and those stakeholders and really delivering what they wanted and in a way that really puts holds the private sector accountable for delivering on that. And I think that what we've seen in other cities is that they're different mechanisms. For example, in so New Orleans, we've invested a few $100 million post-Katrina, really rebuilding a lot of their public housing. So those were different sorts of public-private partnerships. All of that is still wholly owned by the city, and those are more fee development deals. So you're just redeveloping those units and getting a fee for that service, and the city is going to continue to own that land. And so I think that the actual financial models, there are various ways to get things done, but I think what's really important is just laying out what are the public sector's goals, how are these private sector entities going to deliver on those goals, and if they don't, what is the hammer that the public sector has to really, get that control back and, get it back on track.
Yeah, Lise, I guess, one of the things that always comes up when we talk about public-private partnerships, and it came up when the administration, your former colleague Gary Cohn, put out their infrastructure plan, was criticism that this is going to be a boondoggle for private equity investors, boondoggle for Wall Street. Why should we be making people who are rich richer on our public infrastructure projects when they're, for the people? They should be delivered to the people and not, enrich private investors. In your experience, is there enough transparency around these types of arrangements when you have public government working on a project in conjunction with the private sector, providing some funding and then making some profit? Like, do you see this as a set of arrangements between governments and the private sector that are transparent enough that people should feel comfortable with?
Yeah. I think it's a very good question, how to ensure that transparency. And the way we see that at the UN Global Compact is that our 10 principles are sort of hammered in stone. They ensure focus on the environment, on human rights, on anti-corruption, and on labor rights. And they encourage transparency from all stakeholders that are involved. Our initiative on cities, UN Global Compact Cities Program, are working with more than 100 cities across the world. Each of these cities have signed up to these 10 principles and committed themselves to act according to the topics I mentioned, and also report and be transparent on how they are actually implemented in the actual work. So when our city program colleagues work with stakeholders in the cities on specific projects, it's under those principles. And let me give you a concrete example on how that is done. We have been working for several years on a very important project in Brazil with the purpose of how should I say, solving the problem of more than 40% of the drinking water simply disappearing in the pipes due to an outdated water system. So we have been working with private companies, we have been working with the public sector under these transparency principles in a country where, for example, anti-corruption is quite an issue, also in the infrastructure sector. So I think by taking a principle-based approach, by making clear upfront that we expect this public-private partnership to be run in an ethical, in a transparent way, is a really useful way of ensuring that partnerships are done in a responsible way and on a very high set of principles. Yeah. There are many other examples like these, but I mean, since you asked the question in that way, I think it's actually a good opportunity to just, emphasize that just as we ask all companies to run their businesses in a transparent and ethical way, of course, partnerships should be run in the same way, and these principles also goes for the public sector, of course.
Yes. Okay, Amy, I want to talk for a minute about the idea of leveraging public money into a much larger multiple for infrastructure spending. You talked about the infrastructure needs in the United States. I think it was 10 trillion over how long that you mentioned?
Out to 2040.
Okay, so I mean, that's an enormous number, but the administration, when it put out this plan, said we only need 200 billion in federal investment. We can get, through whatever means. They didn't really specify revenue raisers, but their idea was a 200 billion federal commitment could be leveraged into 1.5 trillion with private sector dollars over 10 years, which doesn't get you to that larger figure that you mentioned, but at least over 10 years sounds like a good amount of money, 1.5 trillion. That's a lot of infrastructure, but a lot of skepticism that is actually possible, that you can turn 200 billion federal into 1.5 trillion with private sector. Was that a reasonable number?
So I'm going to answer that question without reflecting too much on the Trump infrastructure policies. I don't necessarily want to cast my opinion here, but...
Are you saying Citigroup doesn't want to criticize Donald Trump on this stage?
Amy Lloyd doesn't want to criticize.
I can't imagine why anybody would worry about that. I don't expect you to do that, but just the math.
Well, exactly, and a perfect example of this is one of the public perceptions of PPPs is that these projects fail. So they're not successful. And we saw that very recently with a number of bankruptcies. So Indiana Toll Road, I don't know if people are familiar with that asset, was financed 2008, 2007 originally, so before the global financial crisis. It was a revenue risk transaction. So the private sector was taking on toll risk. And obviously the forecast potentially didn't take into account the global financial crisis or recession that we were about to undertake. That project went through bankruptcy and successfully came out of bankruptcy, and the ownership was transferred or publicly sold. And the value and the number of dollars that were available in the market to buy this asset, so it's technically a distressed asset, but actually a very valuable asset for the future over the life of its lease arrangement, it was purchased at multiple times the value it was originally executed at. And that's because there is a significant amount of investment dollars for infrastructure assets, particularly in the US, where this market has taken a bit of time to build momentum. So the money that actually came to that project was Australian pension fund money, Canadian pension fund money, US pension fund money. There's an enormous amount of untapped equity and debt financing available for infrastructure assets. So I don't know whether we can turn $200 billion into what we need, 10 trillion or whatever the number might be, but there certainly is untapped capacity there, and I think by drawing on the PPP tool, we can access that money better. And I think just to touch on this concept of failed projects, I think the one thing the public, I hear this all the time from the public, these are assets that are US assets that are being sold to or transferred to foreign companies, for example. That's just simply not true. I mean, these assets are not owned by someone else. They're always owned by the government. They are leased or a concession is awarded for a period of time for them to operate and maintain those assets. And another one I hear often is that these projects always fail. And that also is not true. There are a number of high-profile bankruptcies of these assets. There's a recent one in Texas, for example. But the one thing that is very clear and why these contractual structures work is the taxpayer doesn't spend a cent throughout that bankruptcy or that restructure. So there's no exposure to the government or the public sector in any way, or the taxpayer. These are structured contracts so that they are delivered on time, earlier than the government could probably do them, and they protect the taxpayer from any risk.
Yeah. Tom, something tells me you might be a little bit more willing to be critical of the Trump administration. But talk to me about your take on their plan when they put it out. And
Actually, I'd be very willing. No, there wasn't enough money behind it. And in fact, from our perspective, there are good ideas in terms of trying to streamline environmental permitting and reviews and expedite it, and trying to leverage private funding and other things that were embedded in it. But by coming out of the gate with a proposal that didn't include any new revenue sources and so shortchanged it, I actually worry that it's going to set back what we're trying to do by years by tainting it, by being associated with it. And look, the single most important infrastructure investment in the country, I believe, is building a new tunnel under the Hudson River. For those of you who aren't, the 108-year-old Northeast Corridor tunnels that flooded during Superstorm Sandy, that move about 2 feet a day with the tides because they're anchored in the silt, that Amtrak has said are going to have to be closed in the next 15 years, give or take, to make major repairs, need to be fixed. And that is, the tunnels themselves is probably, let's call it an $8 to $10 billion project, but when you include the approaches to it and the bridge over the Hackensack River and creating a landing spot in New York and things, you're talking $20 to $30 billion. Sounds like a huge amount of money, but you're also talking about taking a facility that currently has about 50 million trips and doubling the capacity, so it goes to 100 million. You're talking about roughly doubling the number of people who live in New Jersey within a 50-minute commute of New York City, the greatest wealth generator that our species has ever invented. There are ways to finance and pay for this, but only if the federal government is a kind of active and willing participant with it. And so what we saw was a proposal that said there's going to be all these private dollars, but didn't put any public money, kind of the pump priming into it. And so the whole thing is stalled. And by the way, back to the time issue, a $20 billion project that's going to be going up in cost at least 5% a year, at least. Every year we delay to build that adds another $1 billion to the cost of that project. Every month we delay adds close to $100 million to the cost of doing this project. And so again, time is not our friend here, and we need to be moving fast on these things, and I think it was a missed opportunity. We were very disappointed.
And honestly, if you think about just the cost going up, that also doesn't just take into account just the lost opportunity of economic growth that you're foregoing during that delayed time.
Absolutely. New Jersey's economy has been recovering very slowly from 2008, in part because of the very poor decision that Governor Christie made to cancel the other project, and because businesses, and Newark is a finalist for HQ2 and Amazon, and that's wonderful. But I'm sure that one of the liabilities it faces is the fact that there's not enough capacity under the Hudson River, and that's not a selling point for Amazon.
Yeah, can anybody else explain to me why this tunnel project stalled out? Obviously there's Christie, but then President Trump seemed to have a personal vendetta against it and did not want it included in the omnibus spending bill. It would have been a veto from him, the omnibus. Does anybody understand why that is? Maybe somebody in the audience knows.
Certainly our next panelist knows, because the head of the Port Authority is up next.
Oh, good.
So I would grill him on that.
I find it enormously frustrating. So Margaret, everybody, when we talk about infrastructure, they say roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, but that's not all that infrastructure is. That's not all that needs to be funded. It needs to be fixed. And Lisa touched on this with the Brazilian water issue. Talk to us about some other pressing needs in infrastructure and how the private sector can help out there.
Sure. I'm a housing junkie. So, when I think about some of the most important infrastructure in, the cities in the U.S. and the world broadly, it's kind of, where do we start our day? So if you don't have a safe, affordable, quality, nice, place that you can live, I think it's sort of downhill from there. And so thinking about a place like Newark, since we were just chatting about it, it's a fascinating example, because you think, it's New Jersey's largest city. It's, has a great port, fantastic airport. great corporate anchors, a lot of educational institutions, and literally not a single new unit of new construction housing was built in the downtown of Newark between 1967 and 2010, which is just absurd. And it was a lot of issues, obviously, just the race riots, population loss, real crime, the perception of crime. And so one of the first things we did in sort of thinking about how do we want to invest in Newark, how do we want to be a part of its revitalization and its growth, and thinking about that infrastructure, housing was sort of at the top of the list. So we've financed a ton of market rate housing there, affordable housing, and just the energy that you see back in the downtown, it makes a big difference, and so many of the other things follow. So now you have Audible.com has moved its headquarters to Newark. Panasonic just built a great new tower. And you think about things like Amazon, as these great corporations are thinking about where they're going to locate and where they're going to invest, it has to be a place where there's quality housing and it's affordable and there's a place to send your kids to school. So housing will always be important. It'll always be a big part of our program. And then we really sort of build out from there. So again, what are the healthcare opportunities? What are the educational opportunities? And what are the job opportunities? Because then going back to housing, no unit of housing is affordable if you don't have a job. And so when we think about infrastructure and being place-based, we also think about just what are the job opportunities that can be built around the infrastructure. So a great example, Brooklyn Navy Yard, right? So great in its heyday, employed over 20,000 folks building ships. And as you've seen that, again, aging infrastructure redeveloped into something for new age economies and new businesses, it wasn't just let's dust off the Navy Yard and build some new buildings. What types of employers are going to be there? How can they connect to the neighborhoods around them? And surrounded by thousands of units of public housing, what are the jobs that are actually going to be accessible to that population? And so just really thinking about what are the types of infrastructure that are going to bring people together, create opportunities, and make sense within a place-based context.
And I think actually, sorry, I'm just on that. Affordable housing is arguably the very first PPP that was used in the US. Yeah. And I think it came out in 1986 with the change in the Tax Act. And in fact, Citi is the number one underwriter and lender in that space. But drawing on the concept of other assets, affordable housing, absolutely. The other spaces we see this in is libraries, civic centers, courthouses, water assets in particular. So there's a lot of investment going into water infrastructure at the moment, purification, landfill assets. So there's a broad spectrum, schools, so there's a broad spectrum of asset class, not just heavy transportation and toll roads that PPPs are used for at the moment.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for mentioning Audible. Just a shameless plug, this afternoon I'll be sitting down with Don Katz, the CEO of Audible, to talk about their experience in Newark and creating jobs in the urban core. So stick around for that if you care to. We only have about 2 minutes left, so I'll give Lise a minute and then Tom a minute. Give us your final thoughts on the importance of public-private partnerships. Kind of sum up for us what you take away from this conversation.
Well, I would like to take the opportunity to spend my minute just addressing the issue of leadership. Because I think there's no doubt from what we have heard in this panel and every other discussion about the challenges for cities and how to create more sustainable urbanization across the world. In such a change process, we always need leadership and visionary leadership. And from my perspective, I think it's amazing to see how mayors have emerged as these amazing leaders that are setting a global agenda. They are getting together in many kinds of fora, trying to create a common agenda for how the urbanization of the world should happen. And I think that kind of leadership in the world that we are living in today is extremely encouraging for all of us. And I wish the mayors of the world all the best in taking this agenda forward. We are definitely here to help anchor the agenda. I think the Sustainable Development Goals is a great framework that I know many of the mayors are actually using as their common agenda. So I think we actually are in for a new phase of creating a responsible globalization, focusing on the infrastructure theme and the public-private partnerships in a much better way than if we were sitting here like 10 or 20 years ago. Maybe.
All right, well, shout out to the mayors. I don't think there's a lot of visionary leadership coming out of Washington, either Congress or the White House, so we got to focus on the mayors and the governors to get this stuff done. We're basically out of time, but I'll let you, Tom, give us the hopeful view of, why should we walk out of here thinking, okay, public-private partnerships are going to work, we're going to get great infrastructure done. I mean, I'm pretty depressed about the whole state of infrastructure and funding of it. Why shouldn't I be?
And I'm going to solve your problem. Your commute would have been fine this morning if New York City had a dynamic tolling congestion pricing system where we took the limited access of our streets and instead of making it be free for some people to drive in and charging an arm and a leg for others, we manage that system. And that's just indicative, and we've come close to getting there 3 times, and we need to get there.
They do that in London, actually.
And they do it in London, and Stockholm, and Singapore, and it connects to, in Stockholm, when they put it in place, childhood asthma rates dropped by 50%.
Exactly.
It's the leading cause of children's hospitalization in the United States, and it dropped by 50% when they put it in Stockholm. So it provides benefits for public health, it provides financing mechanisms, revenue streams, and it allows us to manage our public realm. So these options are out there and people know about them, and I think we just have to keep pushing to make them available, and that'll solve your problem.
God willing, that'll come to fruition, and hope springs eternal. Let's give a hand to our panel. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you at the next session.